The house had learned to keep his secrets. It held them in the curtains that still smelled faintly of his cologne, in the old kitchen clock whose second hand pecked at silence like a bird at grain, in the way the hallway bulb hummed when the night went long. I sat at the table with my hands around an empty mug, listening to Julian move through the routine. He'd perfected keys tossed, jacket flung, shoes half kicked under the couch as if exhaustion made him careless. It was a performance I used to read as devotion to work. Tonight it felt like camouflage. He didn't meet my eyes. He loosened his tie with the drama of a man escaping a noose, then fell onto the bed without the courtesy of a shower. The air he carried in expensive citrus and cedar stalled near the doorway and eddied with something new, a sweet floral trace that didn't belong to me. It clung to the pillow when he rolled over and began to snore, steady and innocent as a metronome. 40 years is a long time to be married. It teaches you the acoustics of truth. I moved through the living room, collecting the small debris of his arrival: wallet, laptop, phone, my hands practiced and calm, my stomach tight. The phone screen was on. He hates email, always says the buttons are too small and the app's too busy. Still, there it was, a single line glowing in the dark. "You were incredible tonight, Dad." A red heart bled after the words. The word "Dad" broke my breath in two, not because it was impossible, but because it was intimate, not our son's voice, no. That's not how he writes, not how he speaks to his father. The address looked like nonsense, an alphabet soup with a number welded to the end. No thread, no history, just the message and a quiet red pulse that felt like a dare. I set the phone down exactly where it had been, the way I return hot pans to cool coils, precise, quiet, no evidence of heat. The clock pecked on. I gathered the clothes he'd left on the chair and felt a receipt folded in his pocket, smooth as newly printed money. San Antonio, a steakhouse we'd once passed on a drive and promised to try for our anniversary, then never did. The date was tonight. He had told me Dallas. 2 meals, a bottle of Cabernet I knew like a hymn from the year we barely had rent, but still celebrated with a borrowed corkscrew and paper cups. I took a photo of the email, another of the receipt. If pain has a discipline, it begins with documentation. My hands shook only when I lowered the phone. The garage held the late heat of the day. His SUV exhaled a metallic warmth when I opened the driver's door, and the dome light cut a pale circle across the seats. If you've run a bakery, you know how to search a space. Corners first, then the places where crumbs hide. In the glove box, my fingers hit plastic slickness. I pulled it free, and the little cap rattled. Personal lubricant. Used. A dab of residue near the rim, the kind of carelessness people have when they think no one is looking. I stared until my eyes blurred, then slid it back into place like a loaded secret. Under the back seat, I found crumpled napkins pressed with an unfamiliar perfume. Strong, cheerful, defiant. Not roses, not me. I photographed them anyway, glanced over my shoulder like the night itself could tattle, and wiped my palms raw on a shop rag I kept by the air pump. Inside again, I washed with lemon soap until my skin stung. The scent of lemon has always meant clean to me. Tonight it only meant trying. Julian's snoring softened into the tiny breath catch he's had since that winter flu 10 years ago. The sound used to make me reach out and touch his shoulder in the dark. I sat at the kitchen table and watched his phone from across the room, as if it might confess again. His messages were scrubbed, almost sterile. Work talk, logistics. Not even a joke from an old friend. No sent mail trails, trash can empty. It looked like a hotel room the day after a guest who never unpacked. I told myself not to cry, because tears would make me clumsy. Instead, I made a list on the back of a grocery receipt. Date, time, the name of the steakhouse, the exact wording of the email, the location of the tube, where the napkins were, and what the car smelled like. I wrote the word Allison, then crossed it out so hard the paper thinned. My hand did that on its own. The suspicion had been a shadow I'd refused to trace. Now it had edges. Morning became a habit I couldn't keep. The sky was a pale wash when I stood at the stove and fried eggs he barely touched. He said he had an important meeting, the way he always did, that rehearsed authority that used to make me proud of his place in the world. I poured him coffee, the strong black he prefers, and watched him lie without blinking. "Be careful," I said. Because good manners survive wars. When he left, the house reset to quiet. I called Mrs. Miller. Years ago, when I was still learning which suppliers delivered on time and which smiled and handed you flour like it was a favor, she told me, "If you ever need to know a thing, call Thomas. He's blessed with discretion." I had laughed then. Today she heard my breath before my voice. "I'll text you his number," she said softly, as if we were in a church. The cafe at noon was all tile echoes and espresso steam. I chose a corner where I could see the door and the street, old habit from a life of waiting for deliveries, waiting for my husband, waiting for proof. Thomas was not the trench coat fantasy of television. He wore a light blue shirt and carried a notebook that had been opened so often it curled at the edges. He listened like the flower listens when you pour water into it, no judgment, only attention. I slid the flash drive across the table without touching his hand. "This is what I have," I said. "It may be nothing. It may be everything." He nodded. "I'll start today. If there's nothing, I'll say nothing. If there's something, we will be precise." Be careful, I wanted to add, the same way I say it to the boys who fix the ovens when the pilot light stutters. Instead, I said, "Thank you," and pretended my coffee was not cold. Night and the bakery are old companions. While the mixers thudded and the smell of yeast made the walls feel forgiving, my phone buzzed once with the politeness of bad news. A photo. Julian in his light blue shirt, the one he wears when he wants to look put together without trying. His hand in a woman's at the door of a restaurant whose candles reflected in the window like fireflies. I zoomed until the pixels trembled. Allison, the dress tight, her lipstick too red for morning. They looked like two people whose bodies had been talking for a while. I sank into the office chair next to the sack of sugar no one had bothered to open yet. My palm pressed flat over my heart like I had to keep it from standing up and leaving. More images followed. A table in a secluded corner, his glass raised toward her, her smile tipped towards him as if his attention were a lamp she wanted to read by. Then a short wobbling video from a distance, a hotel balcony, 3rd floor. His arm around her waist, her head tucked under his chin, a quick kiss like a seal on a secret. The sound in my head wasn't screaming. It was the meteor thing that comes after the quiet of a decision arriving. I saved everything in 2 places, named the files with dates and times, printed the pictures on the old machine in the back office that sometimes leaves a line through the middle, and slid them into an envelope. I hid the envelope under old birthday photos, beneath Daniel's wide grin and Allison's careful pose from years ago. I thought of our son's jokes at dinner about how Allison and his father couldn't even stand each other. I thought of how she sat far from Julian at holidays, angled her body away like a rehearsal. Later, Thomas sent audio from a parking lot. The recording crackled with distance but not with doubt. Allison's voice was young and sharp as a paper cut. "Get that contract done. I want the whole chain. I want her out of the house." Julian's answer was the low baritone he used to reassure investors and children alike. "She won't know. Leave it to me. She trusts me too much." I pressed my palm against the desk until the bones protested. It would have been easier to be only angry. But inside the anger there was a grief for a life I had built by hand, for a love I had mistaken for shelter, for a son who would learn that the 2 people he trusted most could burn him in a single afternoon. I opened a clean page of my little notebook and wrote 3 words at the top: proof, plan, peace. Then beneath proof, I wrote what I had. Beneath plan, I began a list that ran like a recipe: switch, record, smoke, witnesses. And beneath peace, I left white space. I wanted a future there, a quiet one that did not require me to be the night watchman of my own home. When the clock finally stumbled toward midnight, I stood, set my hand on the archway of the kitchen, the way you touch a loved one's shoulder when you leave the room, and went to bed. Julian murmured, rolled, reached across the sheet and missed. I lay awake beside his body and listened to the smallest noises a house makes when it holds its breath. Refrigerator motor kicking in, tree limb brushing the gutter, a pipe settling like a sigh. Somewhere deeper than panic, a steadier woman set her jaw. I have baked through blackouts and floods. I have held the roof with my own 2 hands. I will not go under because a man and a girl with red lipstick think I am soft. By morning, the plan had a heartbeat. The next morning, I stood in the kitchen, hair pinned, apron tied as if routine could still anchor me. The eggs on the skillet sizzled like static, The toast browned too quickly, and Julian, sitting at the table, lifted his coffee without looking at me. His casual, "I'll be home late" big meeting was so rehearsed it almost made me laugh. Instead, I smiled with my mouth, not my eyes, and let him go. When the door clicked shut, the silence fell heavy again. I cleared the table plate by plate, each dish clinking like punctuation. And then I dialed Mrs. Miller. The words wouldn't leave my throat until she answered, her voice warm and seasoned by the years. "I need that number you mentioned once," I said, careful, ashamed. She didn't ask for details, just breathed through a long pause. "Juliet, I'll send it. He's discreet." By noon, I was at the cafe. The little bell above the door jingled with a cheer that didn't suit my mood. I picked a corner seat where the sunlight fell just shy of my table. I could see the street people walking dogs, children tugging at their mother's sleeves, the world oblivious. Thomas arrived without ceremony. No trench coat, no fedora, just a stocky man in a blue shirt, notebook in hand, eyes sharp but not unkind. He listened as I slid the flash drive across the wood. "These are the photos and receipts. The rest is only in my head." My voice cracked on the last word. He nodded, flipping open his notebook. "I'll verify. If there's something, you'll know. If there's nothing, you'll still know." His voice was steady, practiced, like kneading dough until it resists and then relents. That night in the bakery, while the mixers hummed and the ovens breathed, my phone lit up. The first message from Thomas was a photograph. Julian, my Julian, his hand in Allison's as they entered a restaurant. The lighting was warm, romantic, the kind of glow I used to believe only belonged to anniversaries. I zoomed until the picture broke into grains, but the truth held clear. Allison's dark dress, Julian's familiar blue shirt, their shoulders angled toward each other like magnets. More came. A table tucked into a corner with candles flickering between them. Their glasses raised in a toast, eyes meeting as if no one else existed. I saw the tilt of his head, the softness of her smile. Then the balcony shot. The hotel's third floor, curtains swaying in the wind, Julian's arm draped over her waist, her hair brushing his jaw. A kiss, small, careless, but enough to shatter 40 years. I printed the photos on the office machine, the one that always left a faint line across the middle. I slipped them into an envelope and buried it beneath the old family album, under Daniel's graduation photo, where Allison stood smiling beside him. Back then, I thought she was trying to fit in. Now I saw it had been theater. Hours later, Thomas sent audio. The parking lot crackled with background noise, but the voices were sharp. "Allison, ambitious and cold. Get the contract finished. I want the chain. I want her gone from the house." Julian's voice followed, so deep and sure it turned my stomach. "Leave it to me. Juliet trusts me too much. She won't see a thing." The phone trembled in my hands. It wasn't just betrayal of the heart, it was theft of a lifetime. The bakery that had risen from nothing but flour, sweat, and dreams was now a target, something they thought they could forge into their own. I imagined the walls of the shop, the smell of caramelized sugar, the laughter of customers who called me by name. To them, it was business. To me, it was survival, legacy, love. I wrote in my notebook again, the page heavy with ink. Evidence, photos, audio, receipts. Motive: Allison wants the bakery. Julian wants the control. Next, catch them where no denial can survive. I felt something harden in me. Anger, yes, but also a precision I hadn't felt since the bakery's early years, when failure was always one burnt batch away. I was done collecting ghosts. Now I would build the trap. The envelope stayed hidden, the flash drive double saved. And for the first time in weeks, I exhaled. I had proof. I had purpose. The wound still bled, but the edges were no longer raw, they were sharpening. The photos and audio looped in my head like a cruel slideshow. Every smile they shared was a knife twisted deeper. I told myself, you can grieve later. Now, you must plan. Proof alone wasn't enough. Proof could be denied, twisted, swept away by Julian's charm or Allison's false tears. What I needed was exposure, undeniable, humiliating, final. I walked through the house the way I'd once walked through the bakery before dawn, checking every corner, every surface. But now I wasn't preparing for customers, I was preparing for war. The first weapon I chose was already in the kitchen drawer, a tube of clear industrial superglue. I remembered using it to fix a broken chair in the bakery years ago. Tonight, it would fix something else, fix them together, so their lies couldn't wriggle free. The swap had to be perfect. At midnight, while Julian's snores rumbled like a tired engine, I crept into the garage. The SUV greeted me with that same mix of gasoline and perfume. I opened the glove box, pulled out the lubricant with a tissue, and replaced its contents drop by drop. The glue ran thick and glossy, but from the outside it looked the same. I wiped the nozzle, pressed the cap until it clicked, shook it gently. No one would notice. When I slid it back into place, I aligned the floor mat and the seat with the same precision I used to level a cake before frosting. Back inside, I washed my hands with lemon soap until the skin reddened. Betrayal stains in ways no water can remove, but the ritual calmed me. Then I opened the bedside drawer and pulled out Daniel's old college recorder, a chunky little device, outdated but reliable. I slipped in new batteries, tested the microphone, and hid it behind the bookshelf in our bedroom, its cable tucked neatly under a family photo frame from Daniel and Allison's wedding. Their smiles mocked me. I adjusted the frame until it looked untouched. I wasn't done. Revenge requires layers. In the kitchen, I set up a skillet of oil on the stove and tied a thin string to the igniter switch. I ran it across to the window, fastening the end to an old coffee tin heavy enough to pull when I needed it. A tug, a spark, a flame enough to send smoke pouring out the window and convince the neighbors something was wrong. Firefighters would come. The world would come. Secrets would end. The next evening, Julian played his part. At dinner, he spoke casually about important business papers and hinted that I might not understand them. His words were bait, testing if I would question, if I would suspect. I forced a weary smile and murmured, "I'll look later. I'm too tired now." He seemed relieved, almost smug. That night, close to midnight, I pretended to sleep. Through the thin veil of his snoring, I heard him rise, shuffle toward the window, phone glowing against his face. I slipped from bed and hid behind the living room curtain. His voice was hushed, careful, but I caught every word. "Yes, come tomorrow. We don't need a hotel anymore. Juliet's leaving town." Then Allison's voice, sugar over steel. "Perfect. Finally, we can relax." The curtain fabric scratched my cheek as I clenched my teeth. They weren't content with stealing my bakery. They wanted to use my house, our house, as their nest. When he returned to bed, I stayed awake, watching the red digits of the clock slide toward morning. Before dawn, I kissed him lightly on the shoulder, the way I had done for decades. "I need to travel to Nashville for a contract today," I whispered. He stirred, half asleep, muttered, "All right, be careful." But I wasn't going to Nashville. I crossed the street to Mrs. Peterson's house with my purse and my heart hammering in my chest. She blinked at me in surprise when she opened the door so early. "Juliet, what's wrong?" she asked. "Can I stay here for a few hours?" I forced a smile. "I just need to watch my house." She didn't press. She simply led me to her window, poured me coffee, and sat beside me. From there, we had a clear view of my front door. The trap was set. The bait would walk through that door soon, and I would have the truth. The coffee in Mrs. Peterson's hand trembled before mine did. At 10 sharp, a taxi rolled to a stop in front of my house. The driver popped the trunk. Allison stepped out in a fluttering floral dress, dark sunglasses cutting her face in two. She glanced up and down the street like a thief checking for witnesses, then hurried to the door where Julian was waiting. He pulled her inside with the urgency of a man starved, not a father-in-law greeting family. I tightened my grip on the mug until the porcelain burned my palm. My phone vibrated softly. The recorder app was already live, feeding me the soundtrack of Betrayal. Their laughter filled my ears first, glasses clinking, shoes scraping the floor. Then Allison's voice, careless, cruel. "The old hag is gone, right?" I felt my stomach knot, but forced myself to keep listening. The bed creaked in a rhythm I didn't want to name. My breath caught, I almost tore the headphones out. But I waited. My trap was patient. Then it came. Allison's sudden scream, high and panicked. "What the hell? We're stuck! Julian, I can't move!" Julian's growl followed, frantic. "Shut up, hold still, let me." His voice cracked, threaded with rising terror. That was my signal. I reached out and gave the coffee tin a sharp tug. Across the street, the stove igniter snapped, the oil pan flared, and black smoke poured from the kitchen window like a dark flag. Neighbors spilled into their yards, shouting, "Juliet's house is on fire. Call the fire department." Their panic was real. My calm was not. I pressed my lips into a line and whispered, "Now." The siren wailed before I saw it, red lights slicing the street. My son Daniel jumped from the fire truck, helmet under his arm, his command voice cutting through the chaos. "Team, move, ventilate and check for victims." He didn't yet know the kind of victims he was about to find. My chest constricted. Watching him rush into that smoke was like watching him as a boy running into waves too tall for his frame. I wanted to stop him, but this was the only way the truth could surface. The firefighters battered the front door open, boots pounding, hoses dragging. From my headphones came a symphony of disaster. Allison sobbing, Julian snarling, the recorder catching every sound. Then Daniel's voice, shocked and breaking. "What? What is this?" Another firefighter gasped, "Oh my God." Someone tried to laugh, but Daniel barked, "Silence." His command tone cracked, not with anger, but with pain. I didn't need to see it to know. My son had found his wife and his father glued together, naked, humiliated, in the bed that once symbolized my family's foundation. Neighbors crowded closer to the house, whispering in disbelief. "Is that Allison? With Julian?" Unbelievable father-in-law and daughter-in-law. Phones were raised, cameras zoomed. The scandal had already escaped into the world. When the firefighters carried them out, wrapped in sheets that couldn't cover their shame, Allison was sobbing, begging, "Please, help me, it burns, it hurts." Julian muttered curses, his face pale, voice hoarse. "Don't let them see us, Daniel. Close the door." But it was too late. Everyone had seen. Mrs. Peterson stood beside me, her eyes wide, her phone recording. She didn't need words. The look she gave me was enough. Pity and anger, knowledge. She knew I had orchestrated this. And she didn't judge me. She only pressed her hand against mine. The ambulance pulled away with its siren crying into the morning, carrying Julian and Allison cocooned in their disgrace. The neighbors stood in clumps, shaking their heads, murmuring like a congregation after a shocking sermon. Poor Juliet. What filth. She deserved better. Their voices followed me like an echo, but I stayed silent. Daniel stood in the yard, helmet under his arm, staring into nothing. His men packed up equipment around him, avoiding his eyes. He looked like a statue carved out of grief and disbelief, a man hollowed in a single mourning. I wanted to run to him, hold him, tell him none of this was his fault. But this was not the moment. His pain needed to sit, raw and untouched, until he could come to me. From Mrs. Peterson's window, I watched it all, the smoke, the whispers, the fall of the two people who had tried to rob me of everything. My trap had sprung, and the truth was no longer mine to bear alone. It belonged to the whole town now. Hospitals have their own kind of silence. It isn't peace, it's restraint, like the building itself is holding its breath. I sat in the corridor with Mrs. Peterson beside me, the fluorescent lights bleaching the color from everything, even my anger. The ambulance had screamed away with Julian and Allison cocooned in thin sheets, but now the world was still again waiting. A doctor appeared at last, sweat on his brow, his voice low. "We managed to separate them. No lasting damage. They'll need ointment for their skin." Relief flickered on his face, but for me it only deepened the ache. They would walk out, maybe even smile again, while Daniel and I carried scars no ointment could touch. At the nurse's station, a young woman handed me 2 tubes of medicated cream. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry," she said gently, pity in her eyes. I smiled faintly, thanked her, and slipped the tubes into my purse. From it, I pulled 2 identical ones I had filled with mustard that morning, thick and yellow, sharp with vinegar. My hands moved smoothly, practiced from years of bagging orders without error. A simple swap, quick and invisible. I walked to their room carrying not comfort, but consequence. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and shame. Allison lay with her hair tangled, mascara streaking her face. Julian's skin was pale, his eyes shadowed, but his mouth still tried to form excuses. "Juliet, I cut him off with silence. I placed the tubes on the table beside the bed and turned away, my footsteps steady. Minutes later, a scream tore through the hallway. Allison's voice, ragged. "It burns! My skin, God, it burns!" Julian cursed, shouting for nurses. Doors opened, families stared, whispers rushed down the corridor like fire. The disgrace spread faster than the pain. By then, Daniel had arrived. His face was gray, his uniform still smelling faintly of smoke from the morning. He carried a folder, my envelope of evidence, and the divorce papers I had prepared long before the glue and the smoke. Without speaking, he handed it to me. His hands shook. I entered the room again. The chaos was still unraveling, nurses rushing, Allison sobbing, Julian clutching at his sheets. I laid the folder on the table, opened it to the documents, and slid them forward. My voice was calm, but each word rang like a verdict. 40 years of marriage end here, sign and disappear. From my life, from my sons. Allison turned to Daniel, choking out, "Honey, please forgive me. I made a mistake." But Daniel's eyes were stone. He left the room without a word, and the sound of the door closing was heavier than any shout. Julian tried again, his voice trembling. "Juliet, listen to me. I didn't want this." I pulled my hand away from his reach. "Don't say anything else, Julian. You chose your path." The nurse interrupted, stern, reminding him it was a hospital, not a stage. I didn't look back as I walked into the hall. Daniel was there, leaning against the wall, his head in his hands. When I touched his shoulder, he whispered without lifting his face, "Mom, why did it have to be Dad? Why her?" I had no answer. Only the weight of his grief pressed against my own. I wrapped my arms around him, the two of us clinging in silence, both of us stripped of illusions. In that moment, the revenge didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. Weeks passed, though time moved strangely too fast when the bakery was full, too slow when the house went quiet at night. The scandal spread like wildfire. People whispered in supermarkets, murmured at church, replayed videos on their phones. But while Julian and Allison became a cautionary tale, I remained. Not untouched, but unbroken. The bakery was busier than ever. The little brass bell above the door seemed never to rest. Customers came not only for flan and pastries, but for me, for my story, for my strength. "Juliet, you are an inspiration," Mrs. Peterson would say, holding her bag of bread like a trophy. "You defended your family, your work, yourself." I nodded politely, though I knew strength is not a crown. It is what you cling to when everything else is ash. Daniel moved in. He carried his suitcase quietly into the house one evening. No announcement, no drama. "Mom, I'll stay here for a while," was all he said. He took the spare room, and from that day on, we fell into a new rhythm. Mornings found us side by side in the bakery. Me kneading dough, him answering calls, handling invoices with a steady hand, though his eyes still carried storm clouds. Customers noticed. "Your son's a fine man," they told me. I wanted to say, "He always was," but I let the words remain mine alone. One evening over dinner, just rice, beans, and coffee, he asked softly, "Mom, can you make flan this weekend?" His smile was faint, almost shy, but it was the first I'd seen since the fire. I agreed, and when we stood side by side stirring caramel on Saturday morning, the steam rising golden between us, I felt something heal, not all at once, but enough. I began to reclaim myself, piece by piece. I joined a cooking club at the community center, women my age swapping recipes and gossip. They praised my flan, laughed when I teased them with old tricks. I also returned to church, sitting in silence with the colored light of stained glass on my face, not praying for Julian or Allison, but for Daniel, for myself, for a future untethered from betrayal. Sometimes I walked with Mrs. Peterson in the town square. She always carried news, her eyes sparkling. "They're still talking about it," she whispered once. "But they all say you won." I only smiled. Winning didn't feel like triumph, it felt like survival. Still, survival was enough. Daniel, too, began to find his footing again. He came home from the station with stories, not laughter yet, but words at least. "Mom, we put out a fire at the market today. It was close, but no one was hurt." I listened with pride and fear twined together. "Be careful," I said, my voice unsteady. He squeezed my hand, firm. "Don't worry, Mom. You're all I have left. I'll never leave you." Those words were my balm. They carried me through sleepless nights when memories threatened to rise again. And slowly, life reshaped itself. Customers filled the bakery, trays emptied faster than I could refill them. The oven glowed warm. In the evenings, Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table, not in silence, but in something steadier, a companionship built from shared wounds. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the bakery windows and the air was thick with the sweet scent of sugar, I paused at the register, watching customers laugh and chatter. I thought of the long road, the girl from San Diego who dreamed too big, the wife who trusted too much, the mother who nearly drowned in betrayal. And then the woman who set her trap, revealed the truth, and chose not destruction, but survival. Julian and Allison lost everything, their honor, their family, their schemes. But I kept what mattered. I kept my bakery. I kept my son. And most importantly, I kept myself.